Welcome to Wider View, the program that provides perspectives on the news outside the narrow confines of the mainstream media. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway. Today I'm replaying an interview with Dr. John Marciano recorded last year. John is Professor Emeritus at the State University of New York at Cortland and a lifelong social justice and labor activist currently living in Talent, Oregon. John is the author of The American War in Vietnam, Crime or Commemoration, and his newest book is The Russians Are Coming Again. The First Cold War as Tragedy, the Second as Farce. So tell us a little bit, maybe give us a little brief intro to The Russians Are Coming Again.
Jeremy Kuzmarov was a reader on my Vietnam book, and we had been in touch, and I had some thoughts about what was unfolding in the country with the coming election, possible election of Trump, questions about the Russian interference. And we both had a sense that there was something in the air, very much like the original Cold War that began in 1945, and that some of us lived through as children. I remember crawling under a desk, 6th, 7th grade, in PS 52 in Rochester, New York. So I had put together a proposal for monthly review. Jeremy signed on. The bulk of this book is thanks to him. He had been teaching courses on the Cold War for years. So we wanted to approach this by looking at the present, what we call Russia mania about Vladimir Putin, and also to go back to the origins of the Cold War. We might say the second origins of the Cold War in 1945, and also the real origins of the Cold War, the invasion in 1918 by American, Canadian, French, British, Japanese troops against the newly formed Soviet Russia. So that was the sort of the genesis of our thoughts on the book. And I might, if I might, there's an insight from the book and a quote at the end of the book by one of our founders, James Madison, that in a sense might be two of the key premises of the book, because we took a very critical stance vis-a-vis U.S. policy versus the Soviet Union and Russia. So one of them is from the late writer, psychiatrist, and historian Joel Covell, who wrote a book called Red Hunting in the Promised Land, Anti-Communism and the Making of America. And Joel argues that the principal object of the Cold War was never the Soviet Union, never the Soviets, but actually domestic radicals. That the real essence of the Cold War was not about the Soviet Union, not about international issues, but basically about the United States. And so we used some of his ideas to lay out our argument, and we finished the book, what I think is a very profound quote, particularly given what's going on now, where the U.S. is, officially in 7 wars, mostly in Muslim countries, mostly people of color. This is from 1795. James Madison warned, "Of all the enemies to public liberty, war is, perhaps, the most to be dreaded, because it comprises and develops the germ of every other. In war, too, the discretionary power of the executive is extended. Its influence in dealing out offices and honors is multiplied, and all the means of seducing the minds are added to those of subduing the force of the people. No nation could preserve its freedom in the midst of continual warfare. So in essence, we've argued that the United States has been in the midst of continual warfare with the Soviet Union, now Russia, and especially the Third War of the World since 1945. That's most of my lifetime. Very sobering thought, Charles.
It really is. You mentioned early on the 1918 invasion. I really think most Americans have no idea that such a thing ever happened. You cover this a bit in your book, and maybe we can start there because it seems that's the point, the first big conflict between the two.
Well, that's right. And again, I've been trying to read, educate myself, or re-educate myself on these issues, and there were many of the details. I had a rough idea that the United States, American troops, there were not a great number of troops, 10, 20,000 troops, added to troops, of course, from those other countries that I had mentioned. This was under the presidency of Woodrow Wilson. There was a lot of debate about whether the U.S. would do this. Those troops were moved. They were already in Europe, of course, near the end of World War I. And as you know, of course, this coming November 11th, we'll celebrate the 100th anniversary of the end of that war. This was an attack on what was then called Soviet Russia. It did not become the Soviet Union until a few years after the revolution. It was an absolute horrific event. The commander of the U.S. forces, General Graves, began to have serious doubts about what was going on in Soviet Russia. When he came back to the United States, he wrote a book about it. He absolutely opposed it. And for that dissent, he was actually harassed by the newly formed FBI under J. Edgar Hoover. So that, as you mentioned, very few Americans know anything about this. One of the last polls that was taken, and it's a few decades ago, had something like 14% of the American people knew about what was called the Midnight War. I would probably think it's lower today, but a number of scholars have pointed out, of course, that the Soviet people, the Russian people, remember it. They remember it because after losing a few million soldiers in World War II and some civilians in World War I, they had a massive civil war, and it's hard to know exactly what the casualties were, but it was clearly in the hundreds of thousands. So they remember that history. We don't. We know virtually nothing about it.
But I know that after the Second World War, during the Second World War, rather, the U.S. and Russia were, at that point, were allies and worked together to defeat Nazi Germany. It seems as though that alliance fell apart almost immediately at the end of the war. And we began the first Cold War. And maybe you could tell us a little bit about why that happened, who started that, what were the factors that went into that first Cold War?
Well, we essentially argue that the greatest responsibility for the commencement of the Cold War, 1945, 1991, belongs to the United States, not the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, of course, the Red Army had most of the nations in Eastern Europe at the end of the Second World War. A number of those nations, of course, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovakia, had fought as part of the Axis partners with supporting Nazi Germany. They had also engaged in pogroms and absolute massacres of Jews and the Roma, Gypsies in Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union was devastated by the war. I've seen estimates of anywhere from 20 to the 27 million people, including soldiers and civilians, roughly the entire third of the nation from the Polish border, Eastern European borders, to Moscow, and drawing a line south through the country was essentially burned to the ground. Many units in the Red Army at the end of World War II actually were using horse-drawn vehicles. They had no major navy. They did not have an intercontinental air force. And we now know from the internal documents of American planners that they never feared, despite what they told the American people, they never feared the Soviets attacking Western Europe. That was not the threat. So that's not the story, of course, that all of us grew up with, that the peaceful Americans who basically won World War II because we didn't learn anything about actually who it was that caused the destruction of Nazi German armies, and that's the Red Army in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. The real threat was ideological. The real threat was that the Soviets were going to pull out the countries in Eastern Europe and themselves out of the international capitalist order. They were going to develop themselves. They were not going to open up their countries to American investment. And of course, we have just massive, massive volumes of material from the mass media, as you know, when we were growing up, about Stalin, who was a butcher, heinous tyrant, up there with Hitler. But in terms of international relations, Stalin was incredibly conservative. Soviets were incredibly conservative. So the ball was really in Washington's court. And you're right, it started right after the end, in fact, before the end of World War II, when Harry Truman, who had taken over from Roosevelt when he died, lashed out against the Soviet foreign minister and with his aides decided they were going to take a tough stand against the Soviet Union. And of course, what they had in their pocket after the successful experiment of the bomb in New Mexico in July 1945, they had the atomic bomb. And that shaped virtually everything that came after.
What I remember so much from that era, too, particularly at the beginning of it in the early 1950s, is the whole Red Scare, the McCarthyism, the effort to stifle or imprison anyone in the United States who seemed to have ideas that were similar to communism in any way. Not that they were necessarily spies or infiltrators of the Soviet Union. I mean, that was sort of what we were led to believe. But I mean, there was, as you said earlier, there's a part of the reason for this has to do with internal politics, if you will, in the United States rather than the rivalry with the Soviet Union.
Yeah, I'd say absolutely. And to go back to Covell's comment that there was a very strong left coming out of World War II. There was a lot of peaceful sentiment toward the Soviet Union. In the fall of 1945, when people were polled, 70% said they wanted friendly relations with the Soviet Union. We grew up, of course, some of us grew up in what was called the Red Scare, post-World War II, often associated solely with Gunner Joe McCarthy, the Republican senator from Wisconsin, aided by his sidekick, his later lawyer, Roy Cohn. But the Cold War, in terms of the war on dissent in the United States, which included attacks on people like W.E.B. Du Bois, Paul Robeson, among others, also Henry Wallace, who had been vice president under Roosevelt. That Red Scare really started with the Democrats and with the Truman administration 4 years before Joe McCarthy got up in West Virginia and flashed a piece of paper at a speech saying he had 209 or 206 names of communists who were being shielded in the State Department. The number, of course, kept changing and going downward every speech he made. But without the liberals who worked with Republicans to help crush radical unions, later in the 40s, of course, the most progressive unions within the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO, were thrown out for being led by communists, by being communist tainted. So the entire labor movement, the radical edge of the labor movement, the civil rights movement was delayed, a number of scholars argue, by at least a decade or so because blacks who were very critical of U.S. foreign policy, like Du Bois and Robeson, were attacked. But all I remember, as a kid, is we saw the hearings on television, the McCarthy hearings, and everything's around McCarthy and Republicans, and that's simply historically inaccurate.
Now, are there parallels between that whole period and what we're seeing now in terms of the recent vilification of Putin and Russia? When did this current thing start?
Well, I think it's difficult to pinpoint a particular year, but with a little context, actually, I think the best person who's been writing and speaking on this is the historian Stephen Cohen, who's emeritus at NYU and at Princeton, who was probably the foremost American U.S. scholar of the Soviet Union and Russia, who's been taking a lot of heat because he's challenged the party line about Putin and Russia. He reminds people that there were no problems with Russia in the 1990s after the Soviet Union fell, after the U.S. Promised Gorbachev that NATO would not move one more inch to the east, and then, of course, beginning under George Herbert Walker Bush, but especially under the Democrat, again, Bill Clinton, and beyond, the United States continued to organize nations in Eastern Europe right up to the Russian border as part of NATO. Cohen reminds people how this might look if the position were reversed and the Russians were doing this and having nations like Canada and Mexico in a Warsaw Pact. During the 90s, of course, the totally drunken clown, Boris Yeltsin, was absolutely supported by the Clinton administration. In fact, when it's ironic, it's almost laughable when we talk about meddling in elections, that the United States essentially totally orchestrated Yeltsin's re-election in 1996. There was a big story in Time magazine with a picture of Yeltsin on the cover. We have all the evidence now. The Russians remember that because in that period, those first 10 or 12 years after the Soviet Union fell, was the most devastating decline in the history of any advanced industrial country in history. Infant mortality went up, life mortality went up, homelessness, unemployment, while Yeltsin, with help from the U.S. and his Russian oligarchs, looted the country. Of course, some of those Russian oligarchs started making connections with our present president. It's a no-brainer. I mean, Trump, of course, has had connections with Russian mafia types for a long time. So Yeltsin appoints, former KGB analyst Vladimir Putin. Putin begins to challenge the oligarchs, begins going after them, begins to challenge the U.S., particularly around the war in Iraq. He was very supportive of the beginning of the war on terror. In fact, allowing the United States to use Russian territory to ship things into the war in Afghanistan. I think the real demonology that's similar with the old Cold War is that the U.S. cannot dictate to Putin as it could not dictate to the old Soviet Union what will happen in the world. Putin's crime is not that he may be authoritarian, maybe that he even is a little too cozy with the oligarchs, etc. He's actually conservative. He supports the Orthodox Church. His real crime, like Saddam Hussein's crime, is that he's too independent. He's a nationalist. He's not going to let the United States determine what happens unilaterally in the world. And since, let's say, roughly around 2003, he has just been vilified in the American press, and particularly over the last 2 or 3 years. It's almost not a day goes by in the New York Times that there's a nasty article about him, about Russia, etc. It's incredible, absolutely incredible.
It really is. And we also have here a sort of parallel to the to the Red Scare in the whole debacle around Russian troll farms, and now labeling anyone who disagrees with U.S. foreign policy as some kind of Russian troll or apologist for Putin or whatever. I mean, there's some echoes of the early 1950s here.
Oh, absolutely, and one would not know from reading the Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, and of course watching the Russia Mania Hour with Rachel Maddow and then folks on CNN. But there's actually a rich dissenting trove of material, but it has not been able to crack into the Times and the mainstream or corporate media that one finds at Consortium News, at CNET, at TruthDig, at a site that Stephen Cohen, he writes. It's basically based on a show he's been doing for the last 5 years with John Batchelor on a New York radio program, where he'll have an essay and they'll discuss what's going on about Russia. So there are very serious criticisms that have been made, and it includes, too, the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, which is a group of former FBI, CIA, State Department, and other defense analysts who have challenged the fundamental premise of the election issue, because I think that's what's really the base of this. There's no doubt that Mueller is going to, and he has indicted some people, and they've also pleaded out that there have been people who have done tax evasions and have lied about their connections with the Russians. But the real basis of this is that the Russians interfered in the 2016 election, leading Donald Trump to win. And the VIPS group, as it's called, the Veteran Intelligence Group, has argued from the beginning, led by William Binney, Bill Binney, who was former technical director of NSA, that the Russians did not hack the Democratic National Committee's computers, did not hack anything about Hillary Clinton. It was a leak, and they basically decided, the DNC, almost the day after Clinton lost the election, to focus the blame on the Russians. That is pounded day after day after day after day, and there's serious questions about it, but you won't find those questions being raised in any of the corporate media, not a single major newspaper in the country to look at it.
That's true. Not too many of the alternative news outlets seem to be covering it either. But
oh yes, good point. Good point, Charles.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the things we've been trying to cover here, is that issue and the alternative stories about what's going on that Bill Binney and Ray McGovern and others have talked about. And also to try to give people a perspective. I think one of the things that is most difficult for us to do as Americans, it seems, is put ourselves in the other guy's shoes and try to see what it would be like if the actions our government was taking would be taken against us rather than by us, and how we might react. And I think whether we talk about Syria or Ukraine or any of these other issues that are brought up, Crimea and so forth, I think there's no real argument that the United States would have acted any differently than Putin acted for Russia, or if anything, the U.S. would have been more aggressive in pursuing its goals than he was. Now, we have to keep trying to look at that.
Amen on that point. It's very, very difficult. I've been writing some op-eds for the Ashland Tidings, gotten a few responses. There are other people around here who, some have made comments about that some of us are, dupes for Putin, etc. Sort of the old red baiting. I mean, people don't red bait. I mean, ironic is this total demonology of Russia, which is a capitalist country like the United States. It's no longer communist, even though there's an active Communist Party, which I believe is the second largest party in their parliament. But the drenching of daily news, particularly by a lot of Democrats and liberals and erstwhile leftists who swear by Rachel Maddow and MSNBC, but when you press them, I find it is appalling, absolutely appalling, the level of ignorance about the former Soviet Union, the Midnight War, what happened in 1945, the U.S. involvement in the rest of the world since 1945 to 91, which the late scholar Iqbal Ahmad reminds us cost about 21 million lives in what was formerly known as the Third World. The greatest carnage of the so-called Cold War was not cold. When you think of what happened in Southern Africa, when you think of what happened in the Middle East, when you think of Korea, Vietnam, where the best data I was able to come up with is about 3.8 million people dead, civilians and soldiers in Vietnam alone, and then you add Cambodia and Laos. So these incredible wars throughout the world that cost, virtually no lives in terms of a direct confrontation between Soviet and American troops went on. That was the real struggle of the Cold War, not between the Soviet Union and the United States, but in what has been called proxy wars. And people suffered grievously, absolutely grievously. Africa, Asia, Latin America, the overthrow of the Allende government, the U.S. involvement in Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, the things that were happening under Reagan. A lack of knowledge is so deep, it's very difficult to have a discussion with people.
You've been listening to John Marciano, author of The Russians Are Coming Again, The First Cold War is Tragedy, the Second is Farce. The views expressed on Wider View are those of myself and my guests and may not reflect the views of the management at the radio station to which you're listening. Your comments and questions are welcome. Please direct them to widerviewradio@gmail.com. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway. Thanks for listening.